Survivors, Flood, Mississippi, 1927, Chapter 10. Molly sat down, watching Garrett sink to his knees. "Put your shirt on," she said gently. "You'll get a chill." His face bleak. He didn't answer her. She patted the dog, searching for something else to say. "There'll be another plane, won't there? I mean, if they're flying along here, there'll be another one soon, probably." Garrett raised his eyes and nodded vaguely. He shook out his shirt and slid it back on. He kept glancing at the sky, and Molly chided herself again for letting her piece of the drawers get away. If she'd been able to paddle too, maybe they'd have gotten out of the trees in time to be seen. Garrett was lying down again, his eyes closed. He looked blanched, weary. Molly wriggled her toes, looking at the scrapes and cuts on her legs. "What do you think we ought to do now?" "Nothing." Molly stared at him. "What do you mean?" He opened his eyes and frowned. "We have one stupid little board to paddle with, and look!" He raised up on one elbow and showed her his right palm. The edges of the drawer front had raised big, ugly blisters beneath the skin. Molly watched him lie back and close his eyes again. He had deep scratches all over his hands and arms. His right cheek was skinned raw and smeared with blood. The dog whined and pushed his head against her shoulder. Molly hugged it, fighting a dark feeling that was creeping into her heart. They hadn't come through the whole terrible night to just give up, had they? Molly picked up the drawer front, sliding her hand through the pretty brass pull. The dog whined again, but moved away to let her stand up. She placed her feet carefully, taking small steps, lowering herself slowly to sit on the back edge of the raft. She knew Garrett was awake, but had felt the raft rock when she moved. But he didn't say anything. The dog settled itself beside her. Molly lowered the makeshift paddle into the water. She tried to make a long, smooth stroke, but she had nearly put the drawer front in too deeply, and very nearly tipped herself into the water. Molly kept trying. The raft started to turn in a circle, and she shifted to change the thrust of her paddling. After a few minutes of getting nowhere at all, she managed to straighten the raft out and move it forward. Garrett lay silently as she worked. Molly paddled them out from beneath the trees, then started them downstream again, staying far to the edge of the current. She sat still once the raft was moving steadily, the drawer front acting like a rudder again, steering a rough course in the brown water. The last thing she wanted was to end up in the swift torrent of the main channel again. She headed eastward as much as she could. Somewhere the flood had to end. There had to be a place where the river got shallow, then stopped, and dry land began again. But as she guided the raft along, all she could see was brown water stretching in every direction, lying cold and heavy on the land. Molly kept an eye on Garrett, and after an hour or so she was pretty sure he had fallen asleep. "Let him rest," she said to the dog. It pricked up its ears and tilted its head. "He worked harder than I did this morning," Molly told it, grateful for its attention, its bright eyes. She stared to the east as they slowly curved into a wide, gentle turn, following one of the great loops in the river course. She pushed the drawer front deeper, canting it more severely, moving the raft across the sluggish current. She sat tensely. It was impossible to say how the currents would switch and shift as the river turned. The bend in the river seemed to go on forever. Molly listened, fearful, half expecting to hear the deep roar of angry water straight ahead. The Mississippi was full of tricks. Molly's tension eased when the raft came slowly around the last of the curve, and she could see the calm water stretching out for miles in front of her. The worst of the current was still safely to the west somewhere. She could hear it only if she listened hard. Garrett stirred slightly, and she smiled, wishing he would wake up so she could brag about getting them this far, safe and sound, but he didn't. The sun was getting hotter. Molly squinted, hoping to see a line of trees or the grassy top of a levee. Her legs were cramped and aching, and she sighed, thinking about being able to get off the raft. After a few minutes she spotted something and shaded her eyes. It was hard to tell, but it looked like there was an island in the distance, or maybe it was just a tangle of wood or another floating house or something. Molly shifted the drawer front, trying to turn the raft harder. She judged the direction, constantly readjusting, then squinting to try to make out enough detail to know what she was headed for. With every minute that passed, Molly guided the raft farther from the river's normal channel, farther into flood water. The current got weaker, until the raft was barely moving. She tried paddling again, but Garrett had been right. The smooth wood was deceptively sharp-edged, and the pain in her hand was impossible to ignore after 15 or 20 strokes. Molly gave up paddling. The dog left her side to curl up by Garrett, resting its head on its front paws. She nodded at it. "You two just take a nap, then. I surely don't mind." Neither the dog nor Garrett responded in any way. Molly looked past them. The course of the raft was almost perfect now. Molly steered as the sluggish current moved them forward. It was a patch of high ground, maybe one of the old Indian mounds. Pa said there were a lot of them through the delta. Molly glanced at Garrett, resisting an urge to wake him up. She would wait until she had the raft right up against dry ground. Then she'd surprise him. He was going to be proud of her. As the raft swayed gently, Molly found herself yawning. In spite of the sharp hunger pains in her belly and the aching of her cramped muscles, the high ground drew slowly closer, and she could see what looked like shade trees on one side, and the gray-green of early cabbage plants in a garden on the other. She couldn't see a house, but there probably was one deep under the magnolias. The shade looked enticing. Her backside ached as she thought about being able to sit down on soft grass instead of hard, uneven wood. Molly picked up the drawer front and began to paddle again, slowly, careful not to grip the edge so tight that it grated against her skin. The current picked up a little. As she got closer, she decided that it probably was an Indian mound. It looked like the one south of Mayersville, anyway. There were drowned trees all around it, some with just a branch or two raised above the surface. Garrett and the dog were both still sound asleep when Molly spotted the old cabin. So this was just high ground, she thought, not an Indian mound. The cabin was a sprawling affair, like many old-timers' places. One end had a white planked porch. The other, squatty and dark, was made of notched logs. Probably the porch had been added on recently. Molly switched the makeshift paddle from one hand to the other, arching her back to relieve her tired muscles. To the west, out of the corner of her eye, she saw an old brown-gray ripple in the water. She half turned her eyes fixed on the movement. She tried hard to believe that it was just a stray tendril of the main current, or a breeze ruffle on the water, or a stick that had worked itself free from the main channel. But she knew it wasn't. It was a snake. Molly sat transfixed, staring. Like all cottonmouths, it swam with a menacing grace, its wedge-shaped head just above the water. Molly had seen a pig die once, a 200-pound sow, blue and swollen from a cottonmouth bite. Molly watched the snake, the hair on the back of her neck prickling a little. A cottonmouth in the water was a dangerous thing, even worse than on the ground. The snake seemed to be swimming parallel to the raft. Molly back-pedaled a little, hoping that it would just go on downriver. If it swam far enough the way it was going now, it'd probably see the island too. She didn't want to have to watch out for it, though. Seeing it like this was probably a good reminder that all high ground would be infested with snakes. Molly kept back-pedaling, one eye on the cottonmouth. She could not seem to slow the raft enough to let it go past. She paddled faster, uneasy. Had the distance between her and the snake shortened? Molly wiped a sheen of sweat from her forehead. It had. She stared, swallowing hard. It looked like the snake was coming toward her now. Molly began to paddle harder. Maybe it was just trying to find the edge of the submerged land and a dry place to sleep. If she got a little ahead of it, it might pass behind the raft. If it did, Molly was pretty sure she could still turn the raft in time to make landfall. The snake lifted its head a little higher out of the water, and Molly froze as it turned to look straight at her, then lowered its head again. When it began to swim once more, it was coming right at her. "Garrett?" Her voice sounded tremulous and weak in her own ears. He blinked and groaned. The dog shifted but didn't waken. "Garrett!" This time he opened his eyes fully and rolled onto his side. "What?" Molly tore her eyes from the snake for an instant. "Cottonmouth!" She pointed. Garrett rolled forward into a squatting position. For an instant he did nothing more, then he exploded into motion. He grabbed the pole, got to his feet. Startled, the dog jumped up and turned a quick circle, growling. "Hold on to the dog," Garrett said in a tense, low voice. He shoved the pole down into the water, his face rigid with determination, his knuckles white from the intensity of his grip. But the pole plunged downward without resistance. The bottom was out of reach. He shot Molly a look. "Paddle!" Molly leaned forward, grabbing the scruff of the dog's neck and dragging it toward her. She held it close with her right hand, her left gripping the drawer front. She paddled, one-handed, awkward and frantic. "It's coming right at us," Garrett rasped. Molly watched the snake arc up out of the water, opened its white-lined mouth. As it came closer, the dog growled low in its throat, and the hair along its back bristled. "Stay clear of the pole," Garrett shouted, "and keep the dog away." Molly dropped the drawer front and grabbed at the dog. Startled, it snarled at her, then wrenched out of around in her arms to face the snake, the hair down its spine, a ridge of fear. Garrett was raising the pole at an angle, his whole body tense. The snake came closer. Molly could see it sliding through the water, weaving effortlessly back and forth. The sunlight glinted off the silent ripples it left behind. Molly snatched up the board again and paddled as well as she could without letting go of the dog. Garrett widened his stance, and Molly held her breath as he lowered the pole, poking at the snake. It turned aside, and she exhaled in relief. Then it rolled in the water and came toward them again. "Go on," Garrett said, pushing the end of the long pole beneath the snake's belly. "Leave us alone." Garrett lifted the pole and swung it, trying to throw the snake aside, but the cottonmouth flowed over the pole, sliding silently back into the water. It drew itself up, its unblinking eyes fixed on the raft. The dog sprang forward, and Molly hauled it back, its paws scrabbling on the wet logs as it struggled against her. Garrett jabbed at the snake. It rose a little higher out of the water, and Molly could hear it hissing as it waited for the pole to strike again. Garrett managed once more to get the pole beneath the snake, but it simply slid over and down into the river again. Molly watched, horrified, as Garrett stepped back. The snake kept coming, bumping its head lightly along the edge of the raft, slithering into the crack between the two center logs. The dog went crazy, barking, stiff-legged, its eyes rimmed in white. Molly let go of it and took up the drawer front in both hands. "Wait!" Garrett yelled. He raised the pole and drove it downward, trying to shove the sharpened end deep into the crack. The snake writhed and hissed, nodding up, then struck, barely missing Garrett's leg. The dog lunged forward, then danced backward as the snake regathered itself and struck again. Garrett lurched sideways, losing his balance. He fell into the water, his arms wide, his face contorted with fear. Reflexively, Molly reached out to him and saw the snake turn its head toward her. The dog jumped in front of her, and Molly raised the slender board that was the only weapon she had. Snarling, the dog snapped at the snake, then jumped aside when it struck. Molly began working her way around the side of the raft. She could hear Garrett choking on the dirty water, thrashing beside the raft, but she couldn't take her eyes from the snake for even an instant. The dog barked, stiffened when the snake opened its ugly, white-lined mouth. Molly could see its fangs. She raised her plank above her head, staring at the snake, waiting. When it struck, she brought her board down with all her strength, slamming the snake's head against the logs. The dog darted forward in that instant and sank its teeth into the snake's body, then leaped away. The snake whipped around to face it, giving Molly time to raise her board. This time her blow landed just as the snake was shrinking backward from the dog's snarling advance. The board hit corner first, a few inches behind the snake's head. The snake writhed, trying to slide farther into the crack between the logs. Molly jammed the board against it, trying to pin its head. It struggled wildly, lashing its body back and forth. Molly shrieked when it wrapped itself around her leg, but she didn't allow herself to flinch. The force of her weight on the drawer front didn't waver. The long, muscled body flung itself in high arc, thrashing against the smooth oak board that pinioned its head relentlessly against the log. "Here!" Molly glanced sidelong to see Garrett clinging to the side of the raft, the open sack near his hand. He was holding out the knife. "You have to do it. If I try to climb up, the raft will tip, and you'll lose it." Molly nodded, stretching out her hand to take the knife. Her whole body was trembling, vibrating with fear. "Keep the dog back," she managed to say. Garrett nodded gravely. "I will." She saw him move off, pulling himself along the edge of the raft. She heard him calling the dog, but then her whole mind focused on what she had to do. Leaning hard on the board, Molly worked herself into a position above the snake. It struggled even harder than it had at first. When it hit her legs, it hurt like a broom handle. She bent over the snake, resting much of her weight on the board, her breath coming in quick spurts, her legs shaking with fear. She gripped the knife handle hard and placed the blade on the snake's neck. Then, with sudden, terror-driven pressure, she sawed at it. The snake reacted to the first touch of the knife, whipping itself against the logs. Even once its head had been severed, the convulsions went on, and Molly stood up, still shaking, afraid to let go of the board. "Molly, hang on, I'm coming up." The raft tipped to one side, and Molly squatted to keep her balance as Garrett clambered on. For the first time, she noticed the dog was still barking. The bloody knife clattered from her fingers onto the logs. Garrett was prying her hand from bored, talking quietly as though she were a spooked colt. "You did it, Molly. You did it. It's dead." Molly felt something cool brush her cheek, and she shrank away, startled. Garret pointed upward, and she followed his gesture. The clouds had covered the sun. It was starting to rain again.